Hi, I'm Father Jim Forson, and I'd like to offer you a reflection on the gospel of this 12th Sunday in Ordinary Time. You know, when I was a little kid growing up, I and my sisters used to love to watch these scary shows on TV. One was Chiller, and the other was Strange Tales of Science Fiction. And they were on on Friday and Saturday night. And I still remember my sisters and I would be huddled together, clutching each other, terrified what we would be watching. And my mom would walk in and hear us shrieking and stuff and turn off that TV set. What are you watching this stuff for? But it just filled our hearts with all those childhood fears of Dracula or vampires, Frankenstein, and all that kind of stuff. I guess every we all did have our childhood fears. I don't know why I had this crazy idea that at night there'd be these giant crabs under my bed and they would come out and attack me. But anyway, all that stuff is just childhood fears. And, we get older and those fears fade away. And as we get older, the other fears, the real ones, take their place. And we can find ourselves with true fears in our lives, a fear of, being able to make it in this world, or fears for our kids. Are they going to be okay? Fears for our health, fears for this planet Earth. So when we hear in the gospel Jesus saying to us when he says, "Fear no one. Do not be afraid of those who can kill the body but cannot kill the soul." Part of me wants to say, really, Jesus? Really? I mean, when you look at this world of ours, look at the terrific mess going on in the Ukraine. And not just there, but in the Sudan and parts of northern Africa, where the war is just unending, and the poverty and the hunger. Those are things to truly be fearful of. And not just fear that way, but as I was mentioning too, fear for our own health, fear for our own lives. We can be afraid of death. And how do we live with those fears? And we hear Jesus say to us things like, "All the hairs on your head are counted. Do not be afraid. Are you not worth more than many sparrows? Do not be afraid." Boy, it's hard just to latch on to his confident words when there are so many things out there that can truly frighten us. It's interesting that in the Bible, depending on how you want to translate some phrases, that phrase, "do not be afraid," is used over 300 times. Now, does it make you wonder why that idea of the scriptures calling us not to be afraid is so frequently used? I think it's because the opposite of faith is not doubt. You can work your way through doubts and arrive at faith, but fear is the opposite of faith, because fear can eat up our soul. When we allow fears to dominate our life, well, then we start losing our relationships with people around us. We lose our relationship with God. We live in fear. So how do we not? How do we find confidence in Jesus' words saying, "Do not be afraid"? Now, how do we live through this life without having fear eat up our hearts? Well, let me pass on to you this one image that consoles me, and I pray console you too. There is this painting of a saint in our church, Saint Pascal, San Pasquale. He is the patron saint of chefs, cooks. And there's this wonderful painting of him. It shows him standing in this, I guess, 19th century adobe kitchen. And on the stove, his soup that's almost bubbling over, and behind him are pies that he's cooked, and off to one side, bread, and on the walls are those wonderful strings of onions and garlic, and at his feet are the house cats. And he's standing in an oval doorway with his back to us, the audience, and we are looking over his shoulder at what he is looking at. And what he is looking out of his doorway is into the darkness. And he's a rather portly fellow, as many chefs are, and his hands are folded behind his back, and in one hand is a soup spoon. And he is standing at that doorway, just waiting. He is waiting for his invited guest to arrive. And I love that image. I love that image of San Pasquale because really, it's not just San Pasquale. That is a reflection of God. God is that portly chef who's standing at the door and who has prepared this meal and is waiting for us to arrive. He is the one who has been waiting for us forever. Since the moment we were first created, when we were knit in our mother's womb, before even our mother knew she was carrying us, we were only known by one in the whole universe, and that was God. And the idea that God was knowing us then and was preparing a world for us and watching us, he had his eye on us all throughout our life. And he has been preparing for this very moment of our reunion with him all of our lives. And that idea that God has his eye on me, that idea that he has this feast prepared, that gives me great comfort. There's an image we have of heaven. We call it the heavenly banquet. And, when I think of a heavenly banquet, I think of this celebration I was just at last week. And I was visiting this great, big, wonderful Mexican family. And they must have 385 people at this party, cousins by the dozens. And there was just a ton of food and drink, and people were climbing all over each other and eating off each other's plates and laughing and music. And it was fantastic. So when I sometimes think of the heavenly banquet, that's what comes to mind, this wonderful, great celebration. And that's good. But the image I like better is the one of San Pasquale, where it's just me and God, and you and God, and that he has prepared this meal, and he waits for me, for you. And then you sit down with God, and you have this meal, and talk to him about life, about what went well and maybe what didn't. And he talks with us. And that brings me so much comfort. And I hope it brings you comfort too. And when I think of it that way, well, then I'm not so afraid. I'm not so afraid of dying myself. I'm not so afraid of sickness. I don't want it, and it's going to be painful, you bet. But I'm not so afraid. And then when the time comes that I do enter into the darkness of death, it comforts me to think that there's a light in the distance. And that light is a doorway. And in that doorway, there is a portly cook, with a soup spoon in his hand, waiting for me to arrive, to sit down at table with him, and serve me dinner, and chat about life and how it went. It comforts me. I pray it comforts you. And when I think of that image, Jesus' words come home to roost. Do not be afraid.